Okay, sorry that cut out there, and I'm a bit annoyed about it because I was halfway through a sentence. But anyway, this is part 4 to the Liberation Theology and Marx video. I'll just pick up where I left off. Okay, so Marx has contributed to Christianity a hermeneutic of suspicion, which has meant that some texts have been reinterpreted away from the capitalist viewpoint. Which interpretation do you favour? Okay, so I guess the question really is that this is supposed to be based on textbook work, but I've got my textbook over there, but I haven't read through the thing yet, so I'm just gonna I think I've got a bit of an idea of what I can say about this anyway. So I guess the question is the capitalist view of Christianity better, or is the Marxist view of Christianity better? One which promotes egalitarianism, or one which promotes individualism? And okay, so the reference I'm going to make to in support of capitalism, or in support of individualism, is the idea that well, Maxwell Weber wrote a book called The Protestant Ethic and Modern Capitalism, and he said that modern capitalism was that the Protestant ethic and Calvinism was an ethic which drove modern capitalism, and he said that modern capitalist societies had, well, the countries with the most advanced capitalist economies were predominantly Protestant countries, and this is because the Protestants were, well, if you can break down that word and you see the word protest, they stood against the status quo of religion, and the status quo was essentially to perceive jobs and occupations as something which was to be looked down upon, and that something which wasn't the work of God, and only that which was holy was that which was to do with the church. For example, being a priest, that was a holy job. Whereas Protestants came along and they saw all work as something which was doing the work of God. And you can link this to Genesis, where God condemned man to work. And so if this is what God condemned man to do, so then obviously people should do it. And if God's telling you to do it, then it's holy. And another idea behind it was that prosperity was a sign that you were one of the elected, and I think this is a Calvinist view. That if you were successful in this life, then that was a sign that you were elected to go to heaven. So, but people didn't know whether they were elected or not. So obviously, but everyone wanted to be perceived as if they were elected. So people worked the backsides off in their trade, and treat it as an end in itself rather than just something which was to be looked down upon. So there was a quote that I can't quite remember, but it's about a man getting invested in doing his trade, and he so I can't remember much of this, but there was another one from I think he's got initials of B. Was it Thomas Berkeley or something? I don't know. No, it wasn't. But anyway, he said that time is money, and so you should. Okay, so in Catholic countries, they try to make people to realise the value of work by raising the wage, and they figured that by raising the wage that would make people realise that work was valuable, so they would then work longer hours. However, this didn't happen. People realised that they could work for less time but earn the same wage, so that's what they did in Catholic countries. But in Protestant countries, they had a different ethic towards the work almost. It's like they saw the work as an end in itself, and they saw prosperity as a sign of the elect. So they wanted to work as hard as they could, and obviously this is going to have a positive impact on capitalism. And another thing that was mentioned in this book was that you shouldn't give your money to the poor, because that encourages beggary, and it encourages, but it goes against the teaching of God. If the teaching of God is that you're supposed to be working and earning money and being prosperous, and you're giving money to people who aren't doing that, then you're praising those people for for not doing the work of God almost. So you can see that this is quite a right-wing interpretation of biblical scriptures, and it's sort of like, I think it's the religion that most conservative people perhaps abide by. Okay, and another thing that it said is you shouldn't give the fruits of your labour to the church, because this means that you're worshipping a false idol. And that goes against the Ten Commandments. You're giving your money to something which is higher than you. And you apparently shouldn't do that neither. Okay, so there's an argument for a capitalist's view on religion, but then obviously you've got the Marx interpretation, or the liberation theology interpretation, which is basically the idea that we should help the poor because that's what Jesus did. And perhaps there's a stronger case to make for this one, because although the other one's orthodox, it's like, well, it depends which way you look at it, because Jesus clearly did help the poor and he helped the oppressed. So it's like, do you want to follow the teachings of Christ? And maybe you should do that. But I think that there's also a case to be made for the contrary, like I've just talked about with Max Weber's book. But I don't know enough about it to conclude anything. But I won't go too much into the liberation theology perspective, because that's what the video's on, so I'm pretty sure I'll have covered that over the last 3 videos or so. Okay. Marx and Christianity, some negatives. Christians such as Josh Miranda argued that Christianity gives a better answer than Marx to the question, why are things not as they should be? And I wrote a little footnote here saying that's assuming that things are not how they should be. Marx blames external economic causes, but Christians argue that the problem lies deeper in sin and human nature itself, and so this must be tackled and not just the economic system. However, Marx gives a way to help explain why things have gone wrong. Within Marxism, sin is also understood in structural terms. Sin is not so much personal as in the social and economic structures of society, which can make people to be worth less than things. In an earthquake in Mexico, the owners of some firms saved the machinery before they saved the people. Okay, so that's a good example of Marxism there, of the Marxian perspective there, where people are treated as means to an end almost, and that economic things and that which is a commodity is worth more than people. Okay, so I want to read this first paragraph again. Christians such as Josh Miranda argued that Christianity gives a better answer than Marx to the question, why are things not the way they should be. Marx blames external economic causes, but Christians argue that the problem lies deeper in sin and human nature itself. So you could look at the fall story for that with Genesis 3, whereby God kicked them out of the Garden of Eden for being disobedient, and now people are imperfect, therefore they make imperfect decisions. And you can also say, well, if you're going to take an Augustinian view on this, it's the idea that we can't reach perfection on earth, so we're never going to be able to reach that utopia until the afterlife. So that's quite a big distinction there between Marxism and Christianity. Anyway, Marx blames external economic causes. So Marx blames the capitalist system for the downfall of the poor, or for the exploitation, whereas Christians blame human nature almost. Okay. Marx does not give a good explanation for the causes of private ownership. Miranda argues that this is because we have started to worship things and possessions and not God, thus breaking the commandment against idolatry. Okay, so Marx called worshipping things and possessions, he called this commodity fetishism, and it's I guess the clue's in the name. He doesn't give a good explanation for private ownership, and okay, well, perhaps you can explain that with other means, like, well, why would you assume that private ownership is a bad thing to start with? perhaps it's not such a bad thing. Because I think a good society would allow people to have private ownership, because if someone's working for something and they're putting in the hours, then they're saving up money, and then they're going to be able to buy buy things and own things privately without people coming and taking it away. It's like the fact that you have a house and the fact that you're safe inside is because of private ownership. I don't understand why you'd want to eradicate that. Okay. And saying that things and possessions are, that we worship them is idolatry. Is that the case as well? Because we can link that back to Maxwell Weber's book about the Protestant ethic and modern capitalism, where it's like, well, material prosperity is good, but you shouldn't necessarily worship the things and possessions. It's just that you should buy them, and I guess you can see where they're coming from, because perhaps we do worship our things, the things that we own, like our phones and our TVs and other things like that. And I know that in that book, Maxwell Weber, and also I think he based this on Calvinism or something, that we should only have the essentials, but we should keep collecting money and investing it to make more money, because that was well, that's very much a capitalist idea, but that was a sign that we were one of the elect. Okay. The methodology of liberation theology is one aspect that has worried both the Roman Catholic hierarchy and other Christian churches. It is felt to be too close to the Marxist outlook, probably because it uses certain terms and techniques in its sociological approach, which are also found in the works of Marx. This is rejected by Liberation theology. Liberation theology is not a new Marxism, but he accepts a certain amount of overlap. Okay. Gibelin said, "What the theology of liberation affirms is that the history of salvation is not the history of salvation if it does not affect the social and political dimension. That is its essence, even if it is not its totality." Okay. If the theology of liberation has brought anything new, it is the commitment of Christians in the process of liberation, the pastoral commitment of the Church as a sign of the kingdom. The Catholic Church's hierarchy has cast doubt about certain elements of the methodology of liberation theology. However, the Roman Catholic Church has not abandoned its awakened duty to the poor and oppressed. This is typically in the address of Pope John Paul II at Pueblo in 1979. The Pope loves you because you are those whom God especially loves. He himself would, when he was founding his family, the Church was mindful of the poor and needy so as to redeem them, and that is exactly why he sent his Son, who was born and lived among the poor, so as to make them rich in their poverty. So the basic idea behind this page is the overlap between Christianity and Marxism. So you can see. I don't know. I'm really tired. What time is it? 10:30. Okay, so you can see that. I don't know. There's like really not much left, so I'm tempted to just keep going and finish. Okay. So the overlap between Christianity and Marxism, and the fact that this has caused some controversy within the church, because obviously they don't not everyone wants to be associated with the Marxist doctrine because of the way that it's been used in the past throughout history within like Russia and places like that, and there's also the idea that the Catholic Church has a hierarchy and has cast out Yeah, because it poses a threat to the hierarchy in the Catholic Church, because if there is that hierarchical structure, and liberation theology says that those who have money should give that up so that they can become poor, then I've got text. They should give that up so they can become poor, then obviously that's posing a threat to that. Okay. Wait. In 1984, Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict, wrote sympathetically about theologians that use the term liberation to argue for justice and defence of the weak, but he was critical of approaches which had too easily accepted Marxism. I guess perhaps you could be critical of approaches which had too easily accepted Marxism, because you could suggest that it was Marxist individuals who were using the church almost to push their own political agenda. So it's not that they were doing it in the name of God, it's that they were doing it for their own self-interest, and because that's what they wanted to see in society. Okay, keyword. Okay, sin, only political, right. Too much emphasis on Marxist materialism undermines the distinctiveness of Christianity. Others, such as Alistair Key, have argued that it's not that Christians have engaged too much with Marxism, but they have engaged too little. He argues that Christians should take seriously the Marxist view that every new historical stage requires a re-evaluation of beliefs. Key argues that in the end, liberation theologians have been much too conservative, and that is why they have failed. Key suggests that the next stage after secular capitalism would be spiritual socialism. Right. That's pretty funny. Spiritual socialism. So this guy is, like I was saying, one of the guys who was associated with the Marxist doctrine, who's perhaps using it to using the church and using liberation theology to push his own political agenda. So it's not just that this is separate to the domain of the church, but it's actually wider than that. It's actually political. It could affect the whole of society, and obviously politics is a difficult issue to tread. So I don't know. You can see why people are opposed to the idea of liberation theology. In case it leads to things like communism and socialism, which are controversial issues, and it just depends where you sit. And obviously, well, I'm not a socialist, I'm not a communist, so I don't know. Anyway, causes of poverty. So the first one I wrote was the Gini coefficient, which is the idea that success and failure are exponential and not linear. So when you start succeeding, your opportunities multiply and you start succeeding faster, and when you start failing, you start failing faster and faster until eventually you hit rock bottom. And that just tends to be the trend in a liberal society. Okay, another one is not everyone can be wealthy. Perhaps some deserve it perhaps some deserve to be poor in that they didn't make the right choices in life, which would have caused prosperity. And obviously you can talk about the free will debate here and say, well, do people really make their own choices, or are they determined? But, for the sake of pragmatism, yes, people do make their own choices, and perhaps those choices lead to a consequence or an outcome, just as other people make choices, and that also leads to perhaps different consequences. And you can argue that some people have been born into into unfortunate conditions whereby it is much harder for them to pull themselves out of it, and perhaps that they don't even want to pull themselves out of it, because that's just their reality. But there's inequality in life, and I guess you can't really escape from that. Okay, arguably there is poverty as an incentive for the middle or working class to not to become unemployed. So it's like, if there's someone below you, then it's like, okay, well, you don't want to be them. If there's someone above you, that's something to strive towards, and that obviously maintains the capitalist system, and it keeps things running economically smoothly, I guess, or relatively anyway. The poor distribution of wealth is another one. Corruption, exploitation, concentration of ownership. Now those are all quite Marxist or neo-Marxist ideas. Another one, cultural deprivation, unfortunate background, poor education, and addiction. And obviously these are all factors which affect how rich you are in life. Okay, according to the Boff brothers, there are three main approaches. Poverty is the result of vice or laziness and ignorance. Charity simply treat the poor as objects of pity, not persons. Number two, poverty is the result of backwardness. Poverty is the result of backwardness. This is the view of many liberal capitalists. They would tackle the problem through loans and development aid. And number three, poverty is the result of oppression, and so revolution is needed to tackle unjust structures. And this is Marxism. Okay, we're nearly finished. We've got 21 minutes. I'm really hoping this doesn't cut out. Okay. Liberation theology is not about talking about, but about action, political action. Leonardo and Clodovis Boff wrote, "Liberation theology leads to an action for justice, the work of love, conversion, renewal of the church, transformation of society. Sometimes this is dangerous. Between 1968 and 1980, 800 priests and active members of left-wing organisations were murdered because of their involvement in liberation theology." Okay, and that's pretty insane, and I don't promote that whatsoever. But it does say that I think there's a little bit of contradiction because, well, Gutierrez, he's obviously saying, well, he doesn't agree with Marxism. He thinks that liberation theology should be something which is a choice of the rich, should be something that they choose to do, and they should choose to subject themselves to living a poorer lifestyle where they can sympathise and empathise with the poor and put themselves into their shoes and not just give them charity. But then here it's obviously advocating for political action, which is Marxism or socialism, which are systems which don't necessarily work. Okay, that's it. I've got this table that I'll just read through, and it's basically just a summary, and I haven't wrote much, but that's probably a good thing actually. I'll just read it. I'll try not to elaborate too much, and then I'll end the video there. Okay, so Karl Marx didn't like religion because he saw it as the opiate of the masses, because it promoted complete complacency and obedience with false hopes and illusory spiritual goals. This stopped people from revolting against capitalism. Gustavo Gutierrez said, "Theology rises at sunset, help through the day and reflect at night." He talked about the preferential option for the poor. My phone's gonna die. And he was a Dominican priest, one of the main founders of liberation theology. His book was Towards a Theology of Liberation, and he wrote this in 1969. And he said the privileged should learn to be poor themselves, and that the church should become radically egalitarian. Okay, the Boff brothers, Clodovis and Leonardo, talked about three approaches. Poverty is the result of vice, ignorance, laziness. Charity treats the poor as objects and not people. Number two, poverty is results of backwardsness, and this is the liberal capitalist view. I know I've just been through these, but yeah. Tackle problem through loans and developmental aid. Number three, poverty is the result of oppression. Revolution is necessary to tackle oppressive structures, and that's a Marxist view. And here I've wrote 5 theological motivations for the preferential option for the poor from the Boff brothers, and these are theological, Christological, eschatological, apostolistic, and I can't say it. Okay, doesn't matter. The church. Jose Miranda used liberation theology to justify helping the poor. Worship things and possessions, which is commodity fetishism. Christians argue problems lie in sin and human nature, not just external economic factors, which is what Marx said. we have a spiritual problem and not just a prosperous or economic problem. And here I compared it to Bruno Bauer, who fell out with Marx, and Bauer wanted to question religious truth, but Marx wanted to implement economic and spiritual change. Economic and... that shouldn't say spiritual change, I don't think, because Marx probably wouldn't use that word. Anyway, with 4% left on my phone, I finally finished this whole booklet, but lucky us, we've got some more things to go through. So this is an evaluation of liberation theology that I'm going to make another video on, maybe tomorrow, maybe not, because I've got college. But yeah, thanks for watching.